Algae happens to everybody. It's not always a bad thing. It's something that you can manage if it does get out of hand, or we can teach you how to prevent it. That's going to be the main topic of my presentation today. If you have any questions, we can save them for the end, and I'll be happy to answer them. Alrighty, so there are three common types of algae that you'll find inside of your pond, water garden, any outside water feature really. The three main types are microbial, string, and diatomaceous. Microbial, more commonly known as just your typical green free-floating algae. String algae is the tufted hair looking like algae. And then diatomaceous is your sludge or your brown algae. Green algae looks just kind of like this photo right here. I know it's a little bit hard to see, but it's mostly just makes your water almost opaque, green in color, can't really see through it. You don't really see your fish in there if you have any until they breach the surface of the water. String algae, the water isn't necessarily green, but it has green tint to it because of how much green algae is underneath. On the surfaces of like your liner, your rocks, things that are surfaced within your pond. And then brown algae is kind of like the slimy, filmy algae that you see kind of build up at the bottom of your pond. Normally, it's not as noticeable. It just kind of gives it an earthy tone to the pond. We'll get right into it. We'll talk about green algae first. So, like I said earlier, it looks like green, cloudy water, makes it look opaque, not very visually pleasing, just because your main attraction, your fish, are not really visible in this kind of algae, especially once it takes over. Normally it's just particles of green algae. They're suspended in the water column of the pond. Causes can be a number of things, such as overfeeding, overstocking, weather fluctuations like runoff, excess sunlight, very hot days, little aeration, unbalanced water systems, like you don't have a well enough established pond, lack of beneficial bacteria, which those kind of go hand in hand, and like I said earlier, a little bit too much direct sunlight, not enough shade over your pond. Some of the solutions that we commonly talk about for this type of algae is lessen the amount of food given, but also using a higher quality food, so that way you don't have to worry about your fish not having enough nutrition. Use a higher quality food less often, so that we don't have as much excess in the pond, no excess nutrients for the algae to thrive on. Additional filtration, you could use things to help pull the algae out of it, but also prevent it from happening. You can use additional filter media with your new filtration. You can add a clarifier if you want to. Those normally also go hand in hand with filtration. I'll explain that in a minute. And then you could also, if you're in the process of planning your pond, building your pond, consider an area with a little bit more shade and not as much direct sunlight. Just some examples of some solutions here and ways that you can manage algae or prevent it would be, like I said earlier, using a higher quality food that's appropriate for the season. So spring and fall diets when they first come out of hibernation, or going into hibernation, and then like a staple diet if you already have established fish, or if you have younger fish and you're just getting started for mid-season, you want something that's going to be like a higher protein content, you would use like a growth and breeding type of food there. For additional filtration, you can use natural and mechanical filtration. We'll talk about natural first. Natural filtration, such as plants, they like to suck up a lot of excess nutrients, and they basically act as a living filter within your pond. And they also help to provide shade as well, because they can cluster on top of the pond and prevent a lot of excess sunlight. So things like pond lilies, water lettuce, and water hyacinths are really, really great ones that you can bunch up or have to create a lot of really nice looking shade without having to have like a canopy or trees or anything. It kind of helps prevent debris later in the season. For mechanical filtration, you could use things such as like UV clarifiers, which you can put inline, or you can have as a part of your like canister filtration if you'd like to do external canister filter. You could also just use like a sponge, like a coarse media with a clarifier, because a clarifier basically, when you put it in the water, binds up all the gunk that's not supposed to be in there, and then once it runs through your filtration, it gets taken out by the coarse filter pads, and that's why we recommend using those together a lot of the time. That's normally when they work most effectively. The next type of algae we're going to talk about is string algae. This one is probably, gotcha. This one is going to probably be one of the tougher ones to get rid of, unfortunately. But we do have ways to do it. It just requires a little bit more elbow grease on your end for this one. Basically, like I said earlier, it looks kind of like clear water. You don't really have anything suspended in the water, but it almost looks like you've got like hair-like tufts that are growing on rocks, growing on the edges. Sometimes it can be free-floating if it gets disturbed, but most of the time it's anchored to something. It's long, fibrous algae strands. If not controlled, they take over the pond. It'll be all throughout the entire thing. You got to watch with it. Sometimes string algae isn't necessarily a bad thing, but if it does take over and it gets a little bit too much, it can cause a big problem in your pond. Basically, most of the causes of all the algae are the same. It's just the ratio and how they happen. So for this one, a lot of times overstocking, unbalanced, overfeeding, those kind of all happen at once, and sometimes you put it all in all at once and it gets a little too much. But a lot of what has to do with string algae is actually controlled by weather fluctuations, runoff, things like that, because a lot of times it comes from an outside source. It doesn't necessarily always begin right in your pond. The one upsetting thing about this one is there's no real hands-off remedy for this one. This is a very hands-on algae, and it can be tricky to deal with if not done right the first time. So with this type of algae, physical removal is necessary. You're going to have to get in there. You're going to have to scrape the rocks, get the liner, get it all up and get it out. Try and remove as much as you can. And then you can use a high-quality algicide. This is unfortunately one of the types of algae that really does require an algicide. Avoiding of overstocking. When you're first building your pond, you can take into consideration environmental factors like if you live on a hill, or if your neighbor has a farm, or if there's a lot of wind and rain, or if there's a great big tree right next to it. Great for shade, horrible for debris. It's one of those things where it's a give and take type situation, and you're going to want to approach it, because each pond is individual. You're going to want to approach it for what's best for your pond. And just keeping up on maintenance. A lot of times string algae is just one of those things where you have to put in a lot of work until you get it gone. Unfortunately, this is not one that UV clarifiers can always work for. They will help once you do the physical aspect of it, but just running a UV clarifier by itself will not do anything to this algae, because it doesn't flow through the actual unit, and so the unit cannot do anything to it because the unit contains the UV. So we've got some cautions with this one, how to deal with it. Like I said earlier, it has to be physically removed. You're going to be scraping. You're going to probably have to actually get in the pond to get rid of it. The only problem with this one is it is very, very easily propagated by its own means. So when you rip it up, any little bits or pieces that are still left in there can form a whole new colony and start the process right over again. So it's very, very important that if you do not want any string algae within your pond, that once you do that physical removal, you're going to want to skim a lot of it out. You want to get the gunk up out of the bottom of the pond, and you're going to want to get as much of those bits out as you can, just so that way you don't have to worry about it. If you don't have a UV clarifier, once you've done the physical part and you've skimmed out most of that algae, you can use a high quality algicide very carefully. We'll talk more about how to use algicides properly in a moment, but you can use an algicide to make sure that you're getting all of those bits, and the algicide is going to take them out, so that way they cannot actually propagate once again and cause further problems. Some of the pieces will be too small to be skimmed, even with the finest of skimmers. You have to be careful with these. Like I said earlier, UV clarifiers will not work on this unless it flows through. So if you do have a UV clarifier, like once you do the physical part of it, it will flow through it and the rest of it will be killed, and it should end the problem. You don't really want to use algicides if you don't have to. They can be very, very detrimental to the cycle of your pond and the health of your livestock. So there are ways to use it safely, but it does require more hardware and a little bit more work on your end to use them safely. So if that is not an option for you, I don't recommend using an algicide. String algae, if left for too long or if left to get too strong, can bind up the roots of plants that you have inside and rob them of oxygen and nutrients. It could rob your water of oxygen, therefore causing problems for, fish, turtles, frogs, any type of livestock, and even plants that you have within your system. So you definitely want to keep it in check if you do have it. If possible, if it's really, really, really bad and you don't really know if you're going to be able to get it all out on the first shot, or if it's just overrun with it, if you can, use like bins, tubs, spare tanks. Take your livestock out of your pond, salvage as much of your water as you can, so that way you don't shock them or anything, and then go in and really go to town on getting all of that physical aspect out of there. It might mean jump starting your pond again. Every situation's different. I would talk to somebody who's really familiar with ponds before you go that far. So some solutions about how to keep string algae out of your pond, or to get rid of it. We have, same thing, there's always adjusting feeding. Overfeeding happens so often that it is a solution to almost any type of algae. Functional additions, you can add nitrifying bacteria. It's basically going to do your cycle for you, and it's going to help remove excess nutrients, so that way it keeps your whole ecosystem balanced. You could use different ones. We've got a couple different options that I can talk to you specifically about which ones I recommend. And then regular pond maintenance. Regular pond maintenance is one of the best ways to keep algae and any problems out of your pond. Sometimes problems are inevitable. Algae is ultimately inevitable. Everybody deals with it to varying degrees, but the extent of the algae can be managed by taking certain steps. Adding aeration to the pond is a wonderful thing. Even if you don't have an algae problem, aeration is just awesome. You want it. It helps cool the water, helps with fish health, helps with plant health, and overall ecosystem health. So that is a really good option. Even if you don't have any issues with your pond, you should always have an aerator. The third type of algae that we're going to talk about today is brown diatomaceous sludge algae. This is normally mucky, slimy, bottom heavy type algae. It's normally just buildup of excess debris like decaying leaves, leaf litter, excess waste from fish and other livestock that you have in the pond. Outside sources, environmental debris, essentially. Can be caused by a whole bunch of things, mostly excess food being left in there, excess waste because of overfeeding, lack of beneficial bacteria to help remove it, excess debris from, fall time, you got a lot of leaf litter coming down, don't have any netting over the pond, everything gets in there, sinks down, gets stuck, starts to decompose within your pond. Weather fluctuations like storms and stuff can run off into the pond, extra debris that wouldn't normally be in there, and overstocking. Overstocking is a really big one because it's just extra waste on top of everything that's already going on in the pond. Regular management of your pond, like when you first start up for the season, backwashing your filter every so often just to keep it clean, skimming things off of the surface so that way they don't get down into the water and start decomposing, removing the sludge that is down there and decomposing, using nets to prevent things from getting inside your pond, seasonally appropriate cleaners, basically extra seasonally hardy bacteria and sludge removers, stuff like that, extra concentrated bacteria that's specifically for certain types of waste, and then feeding less frequently. Solutions like that, we've got the same old food suggestions that we have up top, seasonally appropriate, high quality. Functional additions include like sludge removers, which is basically just super concentrated bacteria that goes in and helps advance the decomposition of everything. So that way it helps remove it all, clears up the pond, helps restore the natural ecosystem. And then regular pond maintenance as usual, just making sure that your pond is being taken care of, is being managed, and that you're keeping up with everything. And there's just some good netting, basically. We already really talked about it, but there's just some examples of really good things like skimming off the top, getting all the stuff out of the bottom and everything, and then what's best is just keeping it all out in general with an over-the-top net. Pros and cons of algicide. Pros is it helps clear the ponds of existing algae, and if you use it properly, it can help prevent some in the future. Cons, drastically reduces oxygen. It is meant to kill. It goes in there and it is going to rid anything that can photosynthesize, really. It won't necessarily take out all your plants or your fish, but if used improperly or if allowed to be in the pond where there's unstable conditions, it can be lethal to livestock. Causes loss of beneficial bacteria. It can also kill good bacteria. It helps keep your pond cycled and established. It can basically like ruin any maturity that your pond has developed over time. It can raise levels of ammonia, nitrites, and nitrates because it takes out the bacteria that helps maintain all of that and reduce those levels, so it becomes more toxic. Over time, and it just basically creates an overall harsh environment for your livestock to be living in. This is where I talk about my more appealing algae management section. It's more of a preventative than it is a solution. It won't kill algae, but once you remove algae, it will prevent it from being able to take hold of your entire pond. It is not necessarily something that will completely eradicate algae forever, and it doesn't completely stop it from growing, but it makes the environment safe for your livestock, but harsh for algae. It makes it very hard for algae to take hold within an ecosystem. Some of them actually have more benefits than that. I'll get into that in a second, but they can help enhance clarity because you won't have any free-floating algae or anything like that. Some of them help buffer pH and basically work as clarifiers, so it helps keep your pond balanced throughout the whole year, so you can use it year-round. It doesn't have to be just in pond season. It's a maintenance that you can use all the time to help control the entire ecosystem and keep everything balanced the way that you'd like it to look. Cons is it doesn't kill existing algae. It's not an algicide. It will not eradicate algae. If you do go with something like this, the original bales and stuff, which is the original way that they found out, it takes a long time. And it's not guaranteed to work all the time, just because it does take time to ferment and that requires heat. So it's a little bit harder to use these year-round, but it's not impossible. Pellets also take time to break down, but there are benefits to the pellets. The pellets are these guys. It's basically a concentrated version of this that is already partially broken down, but they also bind it together using aquatic peat. So it also helps regulate your pH. So there are benefits to using the pellets. I normally say that using the pellets works for the off season, and then during the real season, you want to use more of like the liquid concentrate, things like that. And basically I can explain how it works now, and why one is more beneficial than the other. So typically during your pond season starts early spring. For these to work really effectively by the time you get to pond season, essentially, you got to start it very, very early spring, almost like late winter. You want it to be probably around February, I would say. You got to toss these in February, because it takes about 4 to 6 weeks for them to start breaking down. And then once you get past the fermentation area where it starts breaking down, it takes another 1 to 2 weeks for once it's broken down for it to release the compounds that make it effective. So essentially what happens is this breaks down, it releases 3 different types of things. It releases hydrogen peroxide and 2 different kinds of acid that are normally used to help as mild natural sides, you could say, like an algicide. It doesn't necessarily work exactly like it, but it's as close as you can get to it naturally without it harming things. And that takes about 1 to 2 weeks once you have the 4 to 6 weeks. So you're talking like 6 to 8 weeks before these start becoming effective. And that's before pond season even starts. And then once you get there, it will release all of the extracts and everything, and those will start to bind and tie up any organic and non-organic material that's not really supposed to be in there, and helps keep it at bay. So that way, all of the extra nutrients, all of the extra stuff that the algae clings on to and starts to use to establish itself are unavailable to the algae. And then you end up with clean and clear ecosystem. These are really great, but a lot of people don't like the bales themselves because they're kind of unsightly. You got this big old thing kind of floating in your pond. Yeah, you just toss it in there. Yeah, so you got that floating in your pond. Some people put it in their like in their waterfall box or anything like that, but the problem with that is a key thing to this is it needs sunlight, it needs heat, because if it doesn't have heat and water constantly, it's not going to ferment. It needs to be basically like submerged. So it can float, and you can put it in a waterfall box, but it might not be as effective as if it were free floating in your pond. That's where we start talking about the benefits of the different types. The next one up in the cycle would be the pellets here. These are both the same product. This is just the liquid concentrated version of it. This is the pellets that still need time to break down. The benefit of this is mostly broken down. The fermentation progress on these is done. The 4 to 6 week waiting period, you don't have to worry about this anymore. These are going to go right in your pond, and they're going to start to break down, but you still have that 1 to 2 week period before they actually start releasing everything that you're looking for. Now, the aquatic peat will go to work instantaneously. So if you're not really all that concerned with the levels of algae that you're going to be experiencing within the season, or you're starting really early and there's really no algae yet and you just kind of want to get a head start on it, but you know you want to buffer your pH as well, these are perfect. You toss them in there, you give them 1 to 2 weeks, they'll start working. You replace them every couple weeks, nothing crazy. These boxes last usually a pretty long time unless you have a massive pond. Then you'd need to get a couple more. But usually this is a bit more cost effective, just because it lasts a long time and you've got the whole box of it. If you want to skip everything, this is like the fast pass of algae management. You put this in and it goes right to work. There's no need to wait for it to ferment. There's no need for it to break down. It's already ready. The extracts are in here. You just pour it in and let it do its thing. Sometimes it can work as fast as a day. Sometimes it takes a little bit longer. depending on the conditions of your pond and the environment and the season that you put it in there. But you can put this in year-round, and it will do its job year-round. The only difference is this one does not have aquatic peat in it. If you're looking for something that's going to do both the prevention as well as the buffering of the pH, the pellets are the only ones that offer that. Now, that's not to say you couldn't use aquatic peat separately from this to put it in there. It's just this, it's not in this bottle when you leave. All right. My mouse disappeared. Thank you for attending that pond day.